They never wanted you to know this. Not your teachers. Not the polite historians who polished America's past until it shined like brass in a churchyard. But beneath the leaves of western Massachusetts, beneath the soil and stone, the truth was buried in silence, and it has rotted there for nearly 2 centuries. In the autumn of 1847, investigators dug into the earth behind Ellington Farm and unearthed something so grotesque that most of them refused to ever speak of it again. 43 graves. 43 children. Not one of them above the age of 13. Each body had been cataloged as relocated, or adopted, or resettled with families heading west. But the ground spoke louder than the lies. The ground told the real story. Those children had never left. They had been swallowed by Ellington soil, consumed by Ellington hands, and offered up to something far darker than charity. You see, Josiah and Constance Ellington were praised as benefactors. They appeared in newspapers as model citizen saviors of orphans, educators of the lost. But the truth was written in bruises, in hunger, in silence, and in the way every child who entered their care somehow stopped aging. 6, 8, 10 years old, and then gone, vanished, as if time itself had swallowed them. No one spoke of it openly then, but whispers traveled like smoke between the mill towns. The Ellington children never grow older. Some said the couple had made a pact, an arrangement to keep themselves prosperous and untouched by the misfortunes ravaging the cities. Others swore it was ritual, but what we know, what cannot be denied, is that children kept arriving, and they kept disappearing. The state buried the scandal. The records were rewritten, and history, obedient as always, forgot. But tonight, I want you to sit in the dark with me and hear what they tried to erase. Because the story of the Ellingtons is not just a forgotten crime. It's a mirror showing you how innocence is consumed whenever power wears the mask of kindness. It's a reminder that the past is not dead. It's a warning waiting to reach you across centuries. And once you hear it, once you understand what the Ellingtons were really doing on that farm, you will never walk through history the same way again. The year was 1829, and Massachusetts was trembling with the pulse of the Industrial Revolution. Smoke from mills blackened the skies above Lowell and Lawrence. Fathers were crushed in factory gears, mothers withered in sickness, and children wandered the streets like ghosts, untethered, starving, disposable. The crisis was fertile soil for opportunists, and that is when Josiah Ellington stepped forward, tall, gaunt, with eyes the color of winter ash and hair prematurely bleached to white. He called himself a man of Christian duty, a farmer devoted to giving children what the cities could not: shelter, instruction, a second chance. To town officials drowning in orphaned mouths, his offer seemed heaven-sent. But the Ellington name carried shadows long before Josiah stood in those municipal halls. His grandfather had fought in the Revolution and been rewarded with 200 acres of Berkshire land. That land became a wound, its boundaries marked not just by meadows and brooks, but by whispers of things buried in the soil long before the Ellingtons arrived. Locals told stories of Indian burial sites disturbed, of strange gatherings at the property's edge where firelight flickered and prayers were spoken in a language no one admitted to knowing. But wealth has a way of silencing rumor, and the Ellingtons prospered. Constance, Josiah's wife, was no less formidable. 38 years old when the first children arrived, she possessed a sharper mind than her husband, eyes like cold steel, and a meticulous grip on every coin, every ration, every calculation of value. Neighbors described her as frugal, industrious, pious. But to those who looked closer, there was something unsettling in the way she spoke of children as if they were not individuals but assets. As if each orphan's worth could be measured like grain in a ledger. The farm itself looked idyllic from the outside. Rolling fields, clean water, a mill humming with honest work. To desperate city officials, it seemed perfect. They wanted to believe. And so, when Josiah proposed to take 20 orphans at a time, asking only $12 per child per year, they signed the papers. Cheap salvation. Easy solutions. They never asked what the children would endure. They never imagined that these children would not grow, would not thrive, would not survive. By the summer of 1829, the first wagon arrived carrying thin faces, trembling hands, and fragile hope. They stepped onto Ellington soil believing they had escaped the cruelty of the mills. What they did not know was that they had stepped into a cage that looked like a sanctuary, but was built for something else entirely. The first night at Ellington Farm stripped away every illusion. The children, weary, hopeful, clutching the remnants of city life, were led not to bright dormitories or warm hearths, but down stone steps into the farmhouse basement. The air was damp, rank with mildew, heavy enough to choke. The walls wept moisture even in summer, and rats scurried in the corners. 22 children were crowded into a room built for storage, given straw mattresses thin enough to feel every jagged stone beneath. A single window, no larger than a cat's body, admitted the only light. It was not a sanctuary. It was a cellar, and it was already waiting for them. Constance was the first to set the rhythm of their lives. At dawn, she struck a rusted pot with a wooden spoon, a sound that still rang in some of those children's ears when they whispered memories decades later. They were forced to dress within minutes, denied time for washing or care. Breakfast was nothing more than cornmeal gruel, watery and gray, sometimes accompanied by bread speckled with mold. Those who refused to eat or gagged at the stench were punished by being denied food entirely for the day. Hunger became a leash, and obedience its collar. Work began before the sun crested the hills and stretched long after it fell. Children barely past 6 years old hauled buckets of water, picked stones from fields, stacked wood, and scrubbed machinery. Their small hands were perfect for reaching into the grinding wheels of the mill, cleaning away debris where grown men's arms would not fit. Perfect, but not safe. Bloodied knuckles and broken fingers became routine. The Ellingtons called it discipline through labor. But to the children, it was torment disguised as instruction. One boy, Timothy Caldwell, barely 8 years old, learned this lesson in agony. His hand was crushed between millstones, 2 fingers mangled beyond repair. Infection set in within days, swelling the flesh black and blue. Josiah's solution was not medicine, not compassion, but confinement. Timothy was locked in a shed without food, accused of malingering until he repented his weakness and returned to work. Pain was not misfortune here. Pain was punishment. Pain was education. Each child quickly understood. There was no escape. Letters home were intercepted. Officials never inspected beyond the farmhouse porch. And every evening, when the sun sank behind the hills, the sound of muffled sobs rose from the cellar, the lullaby of Ellington Farm. Josiah Ellington believed that a child's spirit could be broken as efficiently as a horse, and he practiced this belief with a cold precision that unsettled even the farmhands who briefly worked the property before disappearing in silence. He carried a leather-bound journal, and in its pages investigators later found a phrase repeated like scripture. A child is clay. Clay must be pressed, cut, and fired before it can be useful. That was his gospel, and the orphans, fragile and frightened, were his clay. He divided the children into ranks. The obedient were given scraps of favor, a second piece of bread, a few extra minutes above ground, the illusion of choice. The disobedient or simply the slow were stripped of even the smallest comforts. Hunger, isolation, public shaming. Sometimes he forced the children to line up and chant the failures of the weakest among them until that child wept in front of all. It was not just punishment. It was theater, a ritual of humiliation designed to bind every child's fear to every other child's silence. Constance amplified the system. Her genius was not in cruelty but in numbers, in balance sheets that reduced lives to values. She calculated exactly how little food a child could survive on without collapsing in the fields. She tracked work hours with the precision of a merchant counting coins. She treated every orphan as inventory, flesh that could be spent, labor that could be extracted, value that could be stripped clean before the body gave out. But Josiah's control went deeper than rations and labor. He twisted scripture into a weapon. Every Sunday he gathered the children in the dim farmhouse parlor and delivered sermons not of mercy, but of fear. He told them that obedience was holiness, that their suffering was purification, that to resist him was to resist God himself. And the children, uneducated, starved, desperate for any meaning in their pain, began to believe. He bent their reality until chains looked like protection, until punishment looked like salvation. By the second year, newcomers did not even try to resist. They entered a system already humming with obedience, already soaked in fear. Older children, broken by design, enforced discipline on the younger ones. Silence spread like infection. And so the Ellington farm ceased to be a home. It became a machine, one fueled by fear, maintained by hunger, and perfected through humiliation. It began as a whisper, spoken low in taverns and carried by wagon drivers passing through the Berkshire Hills. A strange detail, too odd to ignore, yet too dangerous to repeat in public. The children at Ellington Farm, they said, did not seem to age. A boy brought there at 7 was still described as 7 3 years later. A girl left at 10 was spoken of as unchanged. Her small hands still calloused, her face still that of a child. At first, townsfolk dismissed it as rumor, the natural confusion of city officials and parish records poorly kept. But whispers have a way of growing teeth, and soon the phrase spread from mouth to mouth like contagion. The Ellington children never grow older. No one dared accuse Josiah or Constance directly. To question them was to risk being branded ungrateful, even cruel, for doubting the saviors of orphans. And yet, those who visited the farm could not shake the feeling. One inspector recalled, years later, how he watched a boy chopping wood in the yard, the same boy he had seen on the farm 2 winters earlier, wearing the same threadbare jacket, still the same small frame. It was as if time itself had passed him by, he admitted. He had written his concern into an official report, but that report vanished from state archives soon after. For the children themselves, the passage of time became a kind of madness. Days bled into weeks, weeks into years, but their bodies refused to mark the seasons. Their faces did not stretch, their voices did not deepen. They remained trapped in a state of perpetual youth, like insects pinned beneath glass. And Josiah, he seemed to take satisfaction in this. His journal hinted at it. The clay resists the fire. They remain pliable, perfect, as if the world itself conspires to keep them mine. Was it malnutrition that stunted their growth? Psychological trauma that froze their development? Or was it something else, something whispered in the soil, in the old stones of that property, something older than the Ellington name itself? To the children, the reason did not matter. What mattered was the despair of watching seasons pass without change, of knowing that while the world turned, they remained fixed in a nightmare that would not end. And for the Ellingtons, it was perfect. Eternal children meant eternal labor, eternal obedience, eternal clay to be shaped. By the mid-1830s, the Ellingtons had taken in nearly 100 children. Yet townsfolk noticed something troubling. No one ever saw those children leave. Records claimed they were placed with families moving west, but no wagons ever departed with them. Inspectors signed documents affirming healthy transfers, yet quietly confessed to neighbors that they had never once witnessed a child say goodbye. Fear silenced their tongues, but unease ate at them all the same. Whispers hardened when travelers passing the farm at dusk spoke of strange sights. Lanterns flickering through the trees. Children lined in perfect rows, motionless, silent, staring forward as Josiah moved among them, reading from his leather journal in a voice too low to hear. Some swore they saw Constance at the edge of the field, holding a ledger and muttering numbers like prayers, each child's name paired with a tally. And always, it was said, the ceremonies ended with a single bell tolling, though no bell was ever found on the property. Neighbors tried to dismiss it as superstition. But those who worked the land near Ellington Farm told of stranger things. They described nights when the fields seemed alive with whispers, as if dozens of small voices were murmuring just beneath the soil. They told of animals refusing to graze near the Ellington boundary, of dogs howling and clawing the ground as though something beneath it stirred. Inside the farmhouse, the rituals grew darker. Survivors, a rare few who escaped and spoke decades later, described evenings where children were forced to kneel in a circle, repeating lines Josiah dictated. We are clay. We do not grow. We are molded by the master's hand. Each repetition eroded identity until the words themselves became a cage. Constance recorded attendance, marking each name with a symbol instead of a number, symbols no one outside the family could decipher. And then there were the disappearances. Children who faltered in work, who grew too weak, who resisted too openly, were taken from the cellar one night and never seen again. Josiah would announce the next morning that the child had been placed. But those who remained knew the truth. They had heard the muffled cries. They had seen the stains in the soil near the back of the orchard. What began as whispers of neglect had curdled into fear of something deeper, something ritualistic. The Ellingtons weren't just exploiting children. They were shaping them, bending time, bending flesh, bending will in service of something no one dared name aloud. By 1837, the whispers had become too loud to ignore. Reports from mill towns showed discrepancies, dozens of orphans sent to Ellington Farm, yet no record of them re-emerging in any household. Some inspectors began asking questions, but their voices were quickly smothered. Files went missing. Testimonies were quietly retracted. Men who pressed too far found themselves reassigned, or disgraced, or simply disappeared from the bureaucratic rolls altogether. The state had begun to sense the rot and chose suppression over justice. Massachusetts was booming. Textile empires churned out fortunes. Railroads cut through wilderness, and investors from Boston to New York staked their wealth on the illusion of progress. The last thing the Commonwealth wanted was a scandal exposing how its most vulnerable were devoured under the banner of charity. The Ellingtons were convenient. They solved the orphan problem on paper. They were economical. They were silent. To expose them would have meant exposing the system that created them. And so silence became policy. But silence required complicity. Inspectors arriving at the farm no longer looked beneath the surface. They stood on the porch, sipped Constance's bitter coffee, signed papers confirming all was well, and left before dusk. Some justified their cowardice by convincing themselves the rumors were exaggerations. Others, especially those who lingered too long in Josiah's presence, seemed almost entranced, their questions dissolving after a single private conversation. A few even defended the Ellingtons in town meetings, describing them as firm but holy caretakers, as though cruelty itself had been baptized by necessity. Meanwhile, the children kept disappearing. A group of 15 sent from Lowell in 1839 vanished entirely from public record. State files claimed they had been relocated to Ohio, but no receiving families were ever found. When one clerk pressed the issue, he was told sharply by his superior, "Do not trouble yourself with the matter further. These children are accounted for." Counted for, a phrase colder than a grave. The state did not fail to see. The state chose not to see. It sealed its eyes, because to admit the truth would mean admitting that progress itself, industry, order, prosperity was built on bones. And so the Ellingtons thrived in secrecy, not despite the state, but because of it. In the cellar, time lost its shape. Days no longer marched forward, they bled together, dissolving into a gray haze of labor, hunger, and punishment. For the children, seasons passed outside the narrow window, but their bodies did not change with them. They remained small, fragile, unripe. It was as if the world had decided they were never meant to grow. And in that unnatural stasis, something inside them began to unravel. At first, they clung to memory, birthdays, names of parents, the sound of a sibling's voice. But Josiah's methods eroded even these anchors. He forbade the children from speaking of their lives before Ellington Farm. When one girl whispered her mother's name in the dark, the others were forced to chant over her until she sobbed, "We are clay. We have no past." Over time, even the boldest children forgot who they had been. Memory became a shadow they could no longer hold. Sleep offered no refuge. Survivors later described dreams that did not feel like dreams, but intrusions, visions of the farmhouse orchard alive with whispers, of soil shifting as if something beneath it sought release, of Josiah's eyes glowing in the lamplight as he repeated the same phrase again and again. The clay must remain soft. The fire must never harden. Night and day bled together, punishment and ritual indistinguishable from one another. The cellar became its own world. The children began to measure life not in years but in cycles of hunger and pain. A new child's arrival meant another pair of frightened eyes, another voice to join the chants. A disappearance meant silence, an empty straw pallet, a reminder that no one was safe. Time did not pass, it devoured. The youngest were the most vulnerable. Barely able to distinguish reality from ritual, they absorbed Josiah's words as absolute truth. To them, obedience was not a choice but a law of nature, as undeniable as rain or nightfall. And when they saw the older ones bend, break, or vanish, they learned quickly. Survival meant surrender. By the 1840s, the cellar no longer held children in the way the world understood them. It held fragments, bodies trapped in perpetual youth, minds collapsing into obedience, identities dissolved into clay. The cellar was not just a prison. It was an alchemy chamber, where innocence was stripped, memory erased, and time itself was bent to the will of the Ellingtons. By the mid-1840s, the Ellingtons had abandoned any pretense of running a farm. The fields went untended, livestock thinned and disappeared, neighbors muttered of neglect. Yet inside the farmhouse, another kind of labor flourished, one that demanded no crops, no cattle, but only children. What had begun as conditioning hardened into ritual. Josiah would lead the children into the orchard at night, barefoot, forced to kneel in concentric circles around a pit dug into the earth. Lanterns swung from the trees, casting their shadows across the roots. He would speak in low tones, words that did not belong to English, phrases whose syllables seemed too old, too jagged to fit the mouths of men. The children repeated them back, their voices trembling, until the night carried with it a hum, a vibration that seemed to sink into the soil itself. Over time, objects appeared at these gatherings. Clay figures sculpted in the children's likenesses, bowls of blood drawn from their own arms, bones of animals that had vanished from the farm. Each offering was placed into the pit and covered lightly with soil. The children were told the earth itself was hungry, and their obedience was the only thing keeping the ground from opening and swallowing them whole. Sarah, Josiah's wife, became the keeper of the ritual order. While Josiah thundered with authority, she whispered to the children in the cellar that the soil remembered them, that their stillness, their unchanging bodies, were proof they had been chosen. She stroked their hair, kissed their foreheads, and told them they were bridges, not children anymore, but vessels. Her tenderness was a cruelty of its own, welding comfort to captivity. Whispers began to seep beyond the farm. Neighbors spoke of strange lights flickering in the orchard, of a droning sound that traveled on the wind late at night. Some claimed they saw Josiah burying jars at the base of trees, others that children's voices could be heard singing long after midnight. But when outsiders approached, the Ellingtons met them with scripture, hospitality, and threats in equal measure. The cellar was no longer merely a place of confinement, it was an altar. Each chant, each cut, each offering fed something that was not Josiah, not Sarah, but older. The children did not understand what it was. They only knew that when the chanting grew strongest, the earth beneath them seemed to breathe. And though none dared speak of it aloud, many felt the same thing. That the orchard, the pit, the rituals were not preserving them at all. They were consuming them slowly, leaving their bodies untouched but hollowing out something far more essential. The first disappearance came on a night of heavy rain. The orchard was slick with mud, the lanterns hissed against the downpour, and the pit had swollen into a black pool. Josiah insisted the ritual proceed. The children were marched out barefoot, shivering, their pale forms encircling the waterlogged earth. The chanting began. The words were older than scripture, carved into the rhythm of the storm. Sarah's voice rose above the children's, soothing and sharp all at once. The earth remembers. The clay must soften. And then a cry. One of the youngest, barely 7, slipped near the pit. The children reached for him, but Josiah's hand shot out like a whip. No one was to break the circle. The boy slid forward on his knees, and in the chaos of thunder, he was simply gone. No splash, no scream swallowed by the storm, just absence. The circle quivered, broke, then was forced back into line. In the days that followed, Josiah explained nothing. He called it a return, as though the boy had gone back to where he belonged. Sarah, in her soft tones, told the children that he had been chosen, that the earth had accepted him as an offering. To resist was to deny the order of things. The message was clear. Some would vanish, and it was not their place to question when. It did not end with one. Another child vanished weeks later, during a ritual where the children were forced to hold clay effigies of themselves over the pit. At the climax of the chant, one figure crumbled in the girl's hands, collapsing to dust. When the children blinked, she was gone, leaving behind only the crumbled clay and a hollow space in the circle. The cellar grew quieter after each vanishing. No one dared whisper the lost names. To remember was dangerous, perhaps even forbidden. The remaining children learned to chant with empty eyes, to kneel without trembling. The lesson was seared into their minds. Survival meant stillness, silence, surrender. The Ellingtons grew bolder. They spoke of the pit as though it were alive, a mouth that must be fed. Josiah described the vanished not as lost, but as taken up. Sarah called them returned to the soil. To the children, though the truth was felt in the marrow, they were being offered, one by one, to something that lived beneath the orchard. Something that did not age them, because it was consuming them slowly, not their bodies, but their essence. And when the night was darkest, some swore they could still hear the voices of the vanished drifting up through the soil, trapped in a chorus that had no end. By the late 1840s, the Ellington farm no longer resembled a farm at all. The fields lay fallow, fences sagged into rot, and the once busy lanes saw fewer wagons pass its gate. Yet the orchard remained strangely alive. Its trees, though gnarled and black-veined, bore fruit in abundance even through lean seasons. Apples that gleamed too bright, too red, their skins slick as if polished by unseen hands. Few dared taste them, fewer still swallowed. Those who did spoke of bitter flesh, of pits black as coal. Neighbors began to whisper openly now, in taverns and at church pews. Some swore they had heard children's voices on the wind long after midnight. Others told of seeing small pale faces peering from the cellar windows, faces that never seemed to grow older. Farmers muttered that animals refused to graze near the orchard, that dogs would whimper and dig at the soil as though something beneath the roots unsettled them. A few dared to accuse directly. One man, a tanner from town, claimed he saw Josiah in the orchard burying a clay jar, muttering over it like a priest at the altar. Another insisted that Sarah was seen in the dead of night carrying a bundle from the house, wrapped tightly in linen, cradled against her chest. When asked what became of it, the orchard itself was his only answer. But accusations ran against a wall of fear. Josiah was no simple farmer. His family's land claims stretched back to the founding of the township, and his voice carried weight in local courts. To call him a heretic, a blasphemer, was to risk ruin. And so, the whispers thickened but never hardened into action. The orchard became a story told in lowered voices, a curse spoken of only at safe remove. Still, the signs spread. Fields adjacent to the Ellingtons began to fail, stalks yellowing overnight. Children in neighboring farms claimed they dreamed of the orchard without ever stepping foot, their dreams of pits that breathed and trees that dripped with blood. Travelers gave the property wide berth, noting the strange hum that seemed to carry on the air as they passed its borders. By 1850, the name Ellington Orchard had already curdled into something else. Not a farm, not a homestead, but a boundary, a patch of earth locals would not touch. Parents warned children to keep away, elders crossed themselves when its name was spoken, and yet, no one dared confront the family directly. It was safer to call the orchard cursed than to admit the truth, that beneath those trees, something was being fed. Inside the cellar, the surviving children lived as if time itself had folded in on them. Days no longer followed the sun. Weeks dissolved into a gray, airless repetition. Yet there was one truth they could not deny. Their bodies did not change. Timothy, who had arrived at 8, was still 8. His hands remained small, his frame slight, though the weight of years pressed on his mind like stone. He remembered children who had come after him laughing, crying, coughing in the night, and he remembered those same children vanishing one by one. But his own skin, his own voice, remained stubbornly the same. He had lived through 12 harvests, 12 winters, and yet the mirror of his flesh betrayed no season at all. The others noticed it too. Sarah Whitcomb, who had entered the farm at 9, began to whisper to Timothy in the straw-dark nights. "We are not children anymore. Not in here." She spoke of how her thoughts had grown heavy, adult in shape, though her limbs betrayed her. Some cried in silence, rocking against the damp stone walls, unable to reconcile the ache of memory with the innocence their faces still displayed. And then came the dreams. They began as fragments, glimpses of roots curling like veins beneath the orchard, of mouths opening in the soil, of the Ellingtons' hands feeding something buried deep. But the dreams sharpened into instruction. The children awoke knowing words they had never learned, feeling hungers that were not their own. Timothy once woke to find himself digging at the cellar wall with his bare hands, whispering sounds that felt like language but were older than English, older than the land itself. Some of the children began to resist, clinging to prayer, to fragments of songs their mothers once sang. Others surrendered, letting the rhythm of the Ellingtons' chants wash through them. They began to sit straighter at roll call, to obey commands with hollow, vacant eyes. Most disturbing of all, they started to sense that they were no longer simply victims. That whatever the Ellingtons were feeding the orchard, the earth, the hidden thing beneath it was feeding back into them. A dark inheritance pressed into their marrow, a bargain signed in silence. One night, Sarah confessed to Timothy that she could no longer remember her mother's face. Not because she had forgotten, but because the dream roots had replaced it. In its place she saw a mouth, wide and endless, waiting in the soil. And in the silence of that cellar, Timothy realized the Ellingtons weren't raising children. They were cultivating something else entirely. The whispers had swollen beyond rumor. By the early 1850s, the orchard's shadow had spread into the pews of congregations, into the ledgers of courts, into the very conversations of men sworn to uphold order. And yet, the reaction was not righteous outrage, but calculation. The first to act was the church. Reverend Occult of the First Congregational convened a closed-door meeting with 2 bishops and a circuit judge. The subject was not salvation for the children, nor justice for the dead, but the preservation of the town's reputation and the financial interests tied to its mills. To admit that a respected family, long woven into the fabric of Massachusetts commerce, had built their fortune on something grotesque would stain not only the Ellington name but the institutions that had entrusted them with so many lives. The bishops spoke in hushed tones of containment. They recommended altering parish records, excising references to the Ellington children from baptism rolls, even burning certain diaries left by families who had raised concerns. The Reverend himself preached the following Sunday that idle talk of curses was the devil's distraction and attack on industrious families and the prosperity God had granted the town. The congregation nodded, uneasy but relieved to be told that silence was safety. Meanwhile, the courts played their own part. Complaints filed by neighboring farmers about strange night burials, about jars unearthed in fields, about livestock gone missing all vanished into the clerk's desk. Judge Merriweather, a known ally of Josiah, ruled these reports inadmissible for lack of credible witness. By credible, he meant male, landowning, and wealthy, which excluded the widows and laborers who had been most vocal. Behind the curtain, state officials drafted a memorandum that would never see light. It acknowledged serious irregularities at the Ellington property, but warned that pursuing the matter could incite panic, jeopardize mill contracts, and drive away investment. The solution, written in cold bureaucratic script, was simple: bury it. Not the children that had already been done. Bury the truth. And so the institutions that claimed to guide men toward virtue chose instead to guide them into silence. The orchard was spoken of as a superstition, the Ellingtons quietly praised for their philanthropy. And any man who pressed further was reminded of his mortgage, his standing, or his place in the pews. This is how corruption breathes longest, not through monsters in the cellar, but through the hands folded in prayer above, pretending not to hear the cries beneath the floorboards. The cellar no longer smelled of damp stone and straw alone. It carried another scent, now sweet, metallic, almost like apples left to rot in blood. The children had grown used to it, just as they had grown used to hunger, to darkness, to time itself dissolving into a haze. But something else had taken root inside them. Timothy noticed it first in his hands. The cuts he once suffered no longer festered. They closed in hours, leaving no scar. When he tried to recall the sting of infection, it was gone, replaced by a faint warmth that pulsed beneath his skin. Sarah, too, began to change. She spoke less of her mother, less of escape, and more of dreams that felt like instructions, dreams in which roots wrapped around her chest and whispered her name. Not as Sarah, but as something older, syllables she could barely pronounce. The younger ones followed suit. They no longer cried when denied food, because hunger itself seemed to shift. What gnawed at them wasn't for bread or gruel. It was deeper, a hollow in the marrow. They began to watch each other differently, not as playmates or siblings, but as mirrors, as if measuring the same strange inheritance reflected back at them. At night, when Josiah descended with his lantern, the children no longer cowered. They sat in silence, their eyes following the flame with eerie calm, their faces pale but unblinking. He read from his blackened ledger, words they did not know yet somehow understood. And when he finished, some children repeated the syllables without being asked, their voices low, inhumanly steady. Timothy fought it. He prayed. He pressed the last fragments of his childhood against the encroaching void, the memory of a mill fire, the face of his mother, the sound of laughter on Boston streets. But the more he clung, the more it slipped. His dreams were no longer his own. He woke with dirt under his nails, with words carved into the straw by a hand that looked like his but moved without him. The Ellingtons were not merely keeping children. They were keeping vessels. Vessels for something that did not age, did not forget, did not forgive. And slowly, inexorably, the children realized they were not being preserved. They were being prepared. The last winter came without warning. Snow sealed the farmhouse in silence, and for weeks the outside world saw no smoke from its chimneys. Yet inside, the cellar flickered with ritual fire. The children, pale, unchanged, their eyes ringed with shadow, were assembled in rows, their straw pallets pushed aside to make room for the circle Josiah had carved into the stone floor. He stood at its center, ledger open, hands lifted. His voice measured as always but louder now, as if speaking not only to the children but to something that pressed against the very walls. Constance moved among them with a bowl of black liquid, smearing it across their foreheads, her fingers trembling though her eyes were fever bright. The children did not resist. They bowed their heads like parishioners, silent, obedient, empty. One by one, names were called. Not their names, not Timothy, not Sarah, but names the earth itself seemed to remember. Names that made the lantern flames bend and gutter. When each child stepped forward, the circle hummed. The air thickened. The cellar stone groaned as if shifting beneath them. And then silence. No scream, no struggle. Just absence. The child gone. The straw where they once lay, undisturbed. Timothy watched them vanish. Sarah too. He tried to cling to his fear, but even that was being taken, smothered beneath the weight of something older. He felt it rising in him, not terror, but recognition. As if every disappearance was not an end but a joining, a merging with the roots that writhed unseen beneath the orchard. He knew in his marrow that they had not been taken. They had been claimed. When his name came, he did not move. He whispered instead, barely audible, a prayer his mother had once taught him. But the prayer cracked midway, twisting into syllables he did not recognize. Words his throat spoke though his will resisted. He felt his body shift forward against his command, into the circle, into the hunger waiting beneath. And then nothing. The state would later say the Ellingtons relocated their wards. The church would declare the rumors baseless. The orchard would continue to bloom, feeding generations of fruit no one dared to eat. But those who walked past on cold nights swore they heard laughter beneath the soil. Laughter that never aged, never ceased, never forgave. And now you've heard it. The story they buried. The fate the institutions refused to name. The warning they hoped you'd never carry. If you've followed me this far, there's no going back. Comment the phrase, "I was never meant to grow older," twice below this video. It marks you. It binds you to this descent. And remember, the Ellingtons were not alone. Every age, every empire, every institution builds orchards of its own and feeds them the youngest it can claim. The question now is not whether this happened, but whether you can see where it still does. You've seen the graves. You've walked the cellar. You've heard the truth they buried. And now you know why the Ellingtons were never spoken of in your history books. But listen carefully. Once you hear this kind of story, you cannot unhear it. It marks you. It reshapes the way you see the world. If you are still here, if you've made it through the descent, then you are no longer just a viewer. You are initiated. Mark that moment below. Type the phrase, "I was never meant to grow older," twice in the comments. Do it, and you seal your place among those who carry this forbidden history forward. Subscribe now, not for entertainment, but because every week, we dig deeper into the stories they swore you'd never know. Stories buried by the church, the state, and the powerful who feed on silence. Like this video if it struck you, share it if you dare, and remember, the Ellingtons were not unique. Every age builds orchards of its own, and if you don't learn to see them, you may already be inside one.